I reject you. The words hung in the great hall like cold winter air, sharp and impossible to ignore. Damon Cross stood tall beneath the hanging iron lanterns of the pack hall, his voice steady, his chin lifted just enough to make sure every wolf in the room could hear him. Around them, nearly 200 members of the Silver Ridge pack filled the wooden benches and stone floor, their whispers spreading like a restless wind. At the center of it all stood Elena Whitmore. She did not argue. She did not plead. She simply looked at the man who had once been destined to be her mate, and allowed a small, quiet smile to touch her lips. No tears. Not a single one. That alone made the room uneasy. Elena had grown up on the far edge of the territory where the pine trees stood thick and the cabins were small, nearly 3 miles from the heart of the pack grounds. Most wolves barely remembered her name unless it was spoken with pity or quiet judgment. She was the girl who worked twice as hard and still stood alone at gatherings, the Omega who moved like a shadow through crowded rooms. Her father had died years earlier during a winter storm rescue, and since then she and her grandmother had lived quietly in a narrow farmhouse with peeling white paint and a crooked porch swing that creaked in the evening wind. Elena had long ago learned the art of silence, the strength of lowering her eyes and letting cruel words pass like distant thunder. Yet tonight was different. Tonight the Alpha King himself sat at the far end of the hall, observing the ceremony with calm silver eyes that reflected the lantern light like still water under a full moon. King Lucian Blackthorn had traveled nearly 500 miles across the Northern Territories to witness the seasonal mate presentation, and the entire pack had prepared for weeks, polishing the wooden floors, hanging banners, rehearsing greetings as if the presence of the most powerful alpha in the country might change their fate overnight. Damon clearly believed it would. He delivered his rejection with theatrical precision, spreading his arms slightly, as if presenting proof that he, unlike Elena, understood strength and status. A ripple of laughter passed through several young wolves near the back benches, quiet but unmistakable. Elena heard it. She felt every pair of eyes pressing against her shoulders, waiting for her to crumble, waiting for the shame they believed must come next. Instead, she lifted her chin by half an inch and smiled a little wider, calm and steady, as though Damon had merely commented on the weather. The reaction was immediate. Conversations faltered. Chairs stopped shifting. Even the restless movement of tails and hands slowed. Something about that smile unsettled the room in a way no tears ever could. And from the high carved chair at the far end of the hall, the Alpha King suddenly leaned forward. The silence that followed Elena Whitmore's smile did not feel natural. It felt heavy, like the moment just before a thunderstorm when the wind disappears and every leaf on every tree seems to wait. Damon Cross noticed it first. His confident posture stiffened slightly as the low murmurs that had begun behind him faded into an uncertain quiet. He had expected embarrassment, maybe tears, perhaps even a desperate plea that would prove his point in front of the entire pack and their royal guest. Instead, he was staring at a woman who looked almost peaceful. Elena stood with her hands folded loosely in front of her simple gray dress, the fabric one she had sewn herself during the early weeks of spring, when the air still smelled like melting snow. The lantern light above cast a soft glow across her face, revealing none of the humiliation everyone had anticipated. She simply breathed in, slow and steady, as if Damon's rejection had lifted a weight she had carried for years. Around the hall, wolves shifted in their seats. One of the younger betas leaned toward his friend and whispered something that was quickly cut off by the elder beside him clearing his throat. On the far side of the room, a group of high-ranking pack members exchanged glances, their expressions tightening with the discomfort of a ceremony that was no longer unfolding the way tradition expected. For decades, the Silver Ridge presentation ritual had followed the same predictable rhythm. An alpha or beta would announce his choice or his refusal, the omega would respond with visible emotion, and the pack would move on as though fate had spoken with simple clarity. But Elena's quiet smile had broken that rhythm. It was as if she had stepped outside the script that everyone else had memorized. Damon shifted his weight, clearly irritated by the attention drifting away from him. "You heard me," he said, louder this time, projecting his voice toward the benches filled with wolves. "The bond between us means nothing to me." A few scattered chuckles rose from the back of the hall again, though they sounded thinner now, uncertain. Elena lifted her eyes toward him, calm and steady. "I heard you the first time," she replied softly. Her voice carried farther than expected, clear in the still air. It was not defiant. It was not wounded. It was simply honest. That made it far more unsettling. Near the entrance, an elderly woman wrapped in a faded blue shawl watched carefully from her seat along the wall. Grandmother Mabel Whitmore had attended more pack ceremonies than anyone else in the room, and her sharp eyes missed very little. She noticed the way the Alpha King had leaned forward in his chair. She noticed the sudden stillness of the royal guards behind him. Most of all, she noticed the faint tremor of recognition that passed through the air, subtle but real, like the quiet vibration of a distant drum. Elena felt it too, though she could not explain why. The moment Damon finished speaking, a strange calm had settled over her chest. For years she had believed that rejection would feel like a door slamming shut. Instead it felt like a window opening. Cool air filled her lungs as though she had been standing outside for miles beneath the wide American sky rather than inside a crowded wooden hall. The whispers had completely stopped now. Every wolf in Silver Ridge seemed to be holding the same breath. Damon glanced around, finally realizing that the attention of the room had begun to drift toward the raised platform at the end of the hall. Slowly, almost reluctantly, heads turned in that direction. The carved chair where the Alpha King sat had not moved, yet the presence surrounding it had shifted. King Lucian Blackthorn was no longer simply observing. His silver eyes were fixed directly on Elena Whitmore. For a long moment Elena Whitmore did not move. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes shifting across the room like a slow tide. Yet her attention remained quietly anchored on the strange stillness spreading through the hall. The lanterns hanging from the wooden beams flickered softly above, casting long gold shadows across the polished floorboards, and somewhere near the back entrance a chair creaked as someone shifted nervously. Damon Cross followed the direction of the room's gaze with growing irritation, turning his head toward the raised platform where the Alpha King sat. Until now King Lucian Blackthorn had been nothing more than a silent witness to the evening's ceremony, a powerful presence that made every wolf in Silver Ridge stand a little straighter and speak a little more carefully. But the moment Damon's eyes reached him, the room seemed to contract around that single point of attention. Lucian Blackthorn had leaned forward in his chair, his tall frame no longer relaxed against the carved wood. One gloved hand rested on the armrest, fingers slowly tightening, as if he were considering a thought no one else could hear. The silver of his eyes reflected the lantern light, but there was something sharper beneath it now, something alive. Elena felt it before she fully understood what she was sensing. It was not fear. It was not even tension. It was awareness, like standing on an open hill when the wind changes direction and the entire landscape seems to hold its breath. She had grown used to avoiding attention in rooms like this, slipping quietly along the walls, carrying trays, delivering notes, doing whatever task kept her invisible to the stronger wolves around her. But tonight invisibility had abandoned her. She could feel the king's gaze resting on her with calm precision, not judging, not dismissing, simply observing as if the quiet girl in the gray dress had suddenly become the most interesting person in the hall. Damon shifted again, uncomfortable under the unexpected silence. "Your Majesty," he said, forcing a confident tone that did not quite reach his eyes. "The matter has been settled." The statement hung in the air, but Lucian did not answer immediately. Instead, he slowly rose to his feet. The movement was not dramatic. There was no sudden gesture, no raised voice, yet the effect was immediate. Conversations that had barely begun again died instantly. Wolves who had been leaning forward sat back as though the air itself had shifted pressure. The Alpha King stood well over 6 feet tall, his dark coat falling straight along his shoulders as he stepped down from the carved platform. Each step across the wooden floor sounded calm and measured, echoing softly through the hall. Elena watched him approach with quiet curiosity rather than fear. That surprised her more than anything else. She had heard the same stories everyone in the Northern Territories had heard. Tales of a ruler who had united rival packs across hundreds of miles of forest and mountain land. A leader whose decisions shaped the lives of wolves she would never meet. Yet the man walking toward her did not carry himself like a distant legend. His presence felt focused, deliberate, almost personal. When he reached the center of the hall, he stopped several feet away from her and Damon, his gaze moving briefly between them before settling once more on Elena. For a moment no one spoke. Then Lucian's voice broke the silence, low and steady, carrying easily across the entire room. "You smiled," he said. The statement was simple, but it carried the weight of genuine curiosity. Elena met his gaze without lowering her head. Yes, your majesty, she answered softly. A faint pause followed, long enough that several wolves shifted again in their seats. The Alpha King studied her expression as though searching for something hidden beneath that calm surface. Most would not, he said. Elena considered the words for a second before replying. Most expected something different. For the first time that evening, the corner of Lucian Blackthorn's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough that the nearest wolves noticed. And throughout the hall, the pack of Silver Ridge realized that the ceremony they thought had ended was only just beginning. The quiet that followed Elena Whitmore's answer lingered in the hall like the last echo of a bell. King Lucian Blackthorn did not look away from her, and that alone unsettled more than half the wolves gathered in Silver Ridge. An Alpha King did not focus his attention on an unnoticed Omega during a ceremony that was supposed to celebrate strength and alliances. Yet there he stood, tall and still, studying the young woman in the gray dress as though the rest of the room had faded into the background. Damon Cross cleared his throat, the sound louder than it needed to be. He shifted his shoulders back, attempting to reclaim the confidence that had slipped from him when the king stepped down from the platform. Your Majesty, he said again, forcing a polite smile. The ceremony has already concluded. I have made my position clear. Lucian turned his head slightly toward him, and the movement alone quieted the faint rustle of conversation beginning to rise again from the benches. The king did not speak immediately. Instead, his gaze moved calmly over Damon's face, as though measuring something that Damon himself could not see. So you have, Lucian replied at last, his voice even and controlled. The tone held neither anger nor approval, yet Damon seemed to shrink a fraction under the weight of it. Around the hall, wolves leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something important was unfolding. Elena remained where she stood, her hands still folded loosely before her. She had never imagined standing within 10 feet of the Alpha King, let alone becoming the focus of his attention in front of the entire pack. Yet the strange calm inside her chest had not faded. If anything, it had grown steadier. Lucian shifted his gaze back to her. What is your name? He asked. Elena hesitated only long enough to draw a breath. Elena Whitmore, your majesty. The king repeated the name quietly, as though testing how it sounded. Whitmore. A flicker of recognition passed through his expression, subtle but unmistakable. From the far wall, Grandmother Mabel straightened slightly in her seat. Lucian continued. And you accepted his rejection without protest. Yes, your majesty. Why? The question was simple, yet the entire hall leaned into the silence that followed. Elena considered the answer carefully. She could have spoken about pride, or dignity, or the years she had spent learning not to beg for a place in rooms where she was never wanted. But the truth felt simpler than that. Because, she said quietly, it no longer belongs to me. A ripple moved through the crowd as wolves exchanged puzzled glances. Damon frowned openly. What does that even mean? He asked, the sharpness returning to his voice. Elena turned her head toward him for the first time since the king had approached. Her expression remained calm, but there was something new in her eyes, something lighter than before. It means the bond you rejected stopped being mine the moment you decided it was a burden. Damon scoffed under his breath, but the sound carried less certainty now. Lucian watched the exchange with quiet interest. The faint hint of a smile returned to his expression, though it never quite reached his eyes. He looked once more at Elena, taking in the simple dress, the steady posture, the unusual composure that had shifted the entire mood of the evening. You speak as though losing that bond does not trouble you. Elena gave the smallest shrug. I believed it would, she admitted. But when it happened, it felt more like a door opening than closing. Several wolves near the front benches shifted uneasily. The words carried an honesty that no one expected from the quiet Omega who had spent years moving unnoticed through their gatherings. Lucian's eyes sharpened slightly, as though her answer had confirmed something he had suspected. Slowly he took another step closer. The lantern light caught the silver threads woven into his dark coat, reflecting softly against the wooden floor. The movement was small, yet every wolf in the hall felt it. Damon noticed it too. Your Majesty, he said carefully. With respect, she is not someone of consequence to this ceremony. The words hung in the air for less than a heartbeat before Lucian turned toward him again. When the king spoke, his voice remained calm, but the temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees. That, Lucian said slowly, is not for you to decide. The words settled over the hall with the quiet certainty of a closing gate. For a moment Damon Cross simply stared at the Alpha King, clearly unsure how to respond. The confidence he had displayed earlier seemed thinner now, like ice beginning to crack under steady pressure. Around them the wolves of Silver Ridge remained perfectly still, sensing that the balance of the evening had shifted in a way no one had expected. Elena Whitmore felt the change as clearly as a shift in the wind across an open field. She did not move, but her awareness sharpened. For years she had learned to read the room around her, to notice small changes that warned her when a conversation was turning unfriendly or when it was time to quietly step away. What she felt now was different. It was not hostility. It was anticipation. King Lucian Blackthorn's attention had settled over the moment with quiet authority, and every wolf in the hall seemed to be waiting for his next decision. Damon finally forced a short laugh, though it sounded strained. "Of course, Your Majesty," he said quickly. "I only meant that she has no standing within the pack. Elena Whitmore has never held a role in our ceremonies. She is simply present." The pause before the final word carried more meaning than the word itself. A few wolves near the back shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the familiar tone of dismissal. Elena had heard it many times before, yet tonight the words slid past her without leaving a mark. Lucian tilted his head slightly, considering Damon's explanation. "Present," he repeated, as though testing the idea. His gaze drifted across the hall, briefly acknowledging the assembled pack leaders, the elders, and the younger wolves seated along the walls. And yet her presence seems to have changed the entire room. The observation was simple, but it struck the crowd with surprising force. Several wolves straightened unconsciously. Damon opened his mouth as if to argue, then stopped when the king's eyes returned to him. Lucian continued in the same calm tone. "You rejected her publicly. That was your choice." Damon nodded quickly. "Yes, Your Majesty. And she accepted your rejection without protest." Damon hesitated, glancing toward Elena as though seeing her clearly for the first time that evening. "Yes." Lucian allowed a brief silence to pass before speaking again. "Then the matter between the two of you is finished." Damon's shoulders relaxed slightly, clearly relieved by the statement. But the relief lasted less than a second. Lucian turned back toward Elena. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "Do you consider the matter finished?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Every wolf present felt the ripple. Elena blinked once, surprised by the directness of the king's attention. She had spent years believing her opinions held little value within pack discussions. Being asked a question by the Alpha King himself felt almost unreal. Still, the calm inside her chest guided her answer. "Yes, Your Majesty," she said quietly. "Then you are free." The words were spoken gently, yet they carried the unmistakable authority of law. Damon frowned, confusion returning to his face. "Free for what?" he asked before he could stop himself. The hall grew even quieter. Lucian's gaze did not leave Elena as he replied. "Free," he said slowly, "to stand without the shadow of a bond that someone else chose to discard." The statement was not dramatic, yet the effect was undeniable. Elena felt something inside her loosen, like a knot finally untied after years of tension. She had not realized how tightly she had carried that expectation until the king's words removed it entirely. For the first time in a long while she felt light. Damon shifted again, clearly unsettled by the direction the conversation had taken. "With respect, Your Majesty," he said cautiously, "that changes nothing about her place here." Lucian finally looked at him again, and the faint hint of patience in his expression disappeared. "You may be surprised," the Alpha King said quietly, "how often the world changes the moment someone stops underestimating the wrong person." As the words settled across the hall, a slow murmur began to rise among the wolves of Silver Ridge. And standing in the center of the room, Elena Whitmore realized that the night she expected to end in quiet humiliation was only beginning to unfold. The murmur spreading through the Silver Ridge hall did not grow loud, but it carried a restless energy that no one could ignore. Wolves leaned toward one another, whispering questions under their breath, trying to understand what had just happened. Elena Whitmore remained where she stood, her shoulders relaxed but her senses sharpened. The king's words still echoed quietly in her mind. "You are free." She had imagined that moment many times over the past few years, though never in front of 200 witnesses and the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. Freedom, it turned out, did not arrive with fireworks or applause. It arrived like fresh air after a long winter, simple and unmistakable. Damon Cross, however, looked far less comfortable with the change in atmosphere. He shifted his weight again, the confident ease he had displayed earlier now replaced by a tightness around his jaw. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "I meant no disrespect. I only wished to clarify her position within our pack." Lucian Blackthorn studied him for a moment without speaking. The king's silence carried more weight than most speeches, and several wolves near the front benches lowered their eyes rather than meet his gaze. Finally Lucian spoke. "Her position appears quite clear." Damon blinked. "Clear, Your Majesty?" Lucian turned slightly, gesturing calmly toward the center of the hall. "You rejected a bond you believed was beneath you. She accepted your decision with composure. The matter is resolved." Damon forced another polite smile, though his voice carried an edge. "Exactly, Your Majesty. That is all I intended." But Lucian did not step away. Instead he remained standing beside Elena, his attention returning to her with the same thoughtful focus that had unsettled the entire room earlier. Elena felt it again, that strange awareness, like the quiet hum of something important just beneath the surface of the moment. The king seemed to notice it as well. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "may I ask you something further?" Elena nodded once. "Of course, Your Majesty. When he rejected you, you smiled." "Yes." "Why?" The question came gently, yet the entire hall leaned forward to hear the answer. Elena considered it carefully. The truth was simple, but explaining it in front of so many wolves felt different from understanding it quietly within herself. "Because I spent a long time believing I needed his acceptance to have value," she said at last. Her voice was steady, though the words carried softly through the hall. "When he rejected me tonight, I realized something surprising. The only thing that actually changed was his opinion. I am still the same person I was 5 minutes earlier." A few wolves shifted uncomfortably at the honesty in her words. Damon's expression tightened, but he said nothing. Lucian's eyes remained on Elena, thoughtful and calm. "And you believe that makes you free?" he asked. Elena allowed herself a small smile again. "Yes, Your Majesty. Because if someone's opinion is the only thing holding a person in place, then letting go of that opinion removes the cage." The statement hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Along the far wall, Grandmother Mabel watched with quiet pride, her wrinkled hands folded together beneath her shawl. She had always known Elena possessed a quiet strength that others overlooked. Tonight that strength had finally stepped into the light. Lucian Blackthorn slowly straightened, as though Elena's answer had confirmed something he had been considering since the moment she smiled. His gaze moved briefly across the gathered wolves before returning to her once more. "Interesting," he said quietly. Damon could no longer hide his irritation. "With respect, Your Majesty," he said, "this discussion seems unnecessary. The ceremony is complete." The king turned his head toward him again, and the irritation in Damon's voice faded instantly under the calm weight of Lucian's attention. "On the contrary," Lucian replied evenly. "It seems the ceremony has only just begun to reveal its purpose." A faint ripple of surprise moved through the hall. Elena felt the same quiet awareness rise again in her chest, stronger this time, as though the night itself was shifting towards something none of them had anticipated. And for the first time since the evening began, several wolves in Silver Ridge realized that Damon Cross's rejection might not be the most important event that would happen before the lanterns burned out. The ripple of surprise moving through the Silver Ridge hall slowly faded into a silence so complete that the crackle of lantern flames along the wooden walls could be heard. Elena Whitmore remained where she stood, aware that something in the air had shifted beyond simple curiosity. King Lucian Blackthorn had not moved away after speaking, and that alone carried meaning. An Alpha King did not linger without purpose. Damon Cross sensed it as well. His confidence, which had returned briefly when he declared the ceremony finished, began to thin again. He glanced toward the benches where several high-ranking pack members sat, as if searching for support, but none of them spoke. Their attention remained fixed on the man standing at the center of the hall. Lucian rested his hands loosely behind his back, studying the room for a moment before returning his gaze to Elena. The expression in his silver eyes was thoughtful, almost analytical, as though he were observing a puzzle that had suddenly begun to solve itself. "Miss Whitmore," he said calmly, "you mentioned something earlier that interests me." Elena lifted her eyes to meet his gaze. "Your Majesty? You said that when someone's opinion is the only thing holding a person in place, removing that opinion removes the cage." Elena nodded slightly. "Yes." Lucian tilted his head a fraction, the faintest trace of curiosity appearing in his voice. Most people discover that truth only after many years of disappointment. Yet you recognized it in the very moment you were rejected. That is unusual. Elena felt a few curious eyes shift toward her again. She had never considered her reaction unusual. It had simply been honest. I think, she said quietly, that sometimes a person knows something for a long time, but does not understand it until the right moment arrives. Lucian studied her face as though weighing the answer. Then he gave a slow nod. That seems accurate. Damon stepped forward half a pace, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Your Majesty, he said carefully. With respect, Elena Whitmore has always been quiet. That is all. There is nothing remarkable about her. The comment earned a few awkward glances from the nearby wolves. Lucian turned toward Damon again, and the room instantly grew still. Is that so? Damon hesitated but continued. Yes, Your Majesty. She has lived on the outskirts of the territory her entire life. She rarely attends pack gatherings. Most wolves barely know her. Lucian's gaze shifted back toward Elena, and this time the faint hint of a smile returned. And yet tonight every wolf in this hall knows exactly who she is. The observation caused several heads to turn as the truth of it settled over the crowd. Elena felt warmth rise to her cheeks, but held her composure. Damon opened his mouth again, but Lucian lifted one hand slightly, and the gesture alone stopped the words before they formed. The king then took another slow step across the polished floor, closing the small distance between himself and Elena. The movement drew every eye in the room. Miss Whitmore, Lucian said quietly, may I ask you one more question? Elena nodded. Of course, Your Majesty. If the bond that once connected you to Damon Cross is no longer yours to carry, what do you believe your future looks like now? The question was unexpected, yet Elena answered honestly. I believe, she said after a moment, that it looks exactly the same as it did this morning. I will return home. I will help my grandmother with the farm. And tomorrow the sun will rise the same way it always does. A soft ripple of laughter moved through a few of the benches, though it carried admiration rather than mockery. Lucian listened to her answer without interruption. Then he spoke again, his voice calm, but unmistakably firm. That may be true for most mornings. He paused just long enough that the entire room leaned forward. However, the Alpha King continued slowly. I suspect tomorrow morning may feel rather different for you. Damon frowned openly. Your Majesty, I do not understand what that means. Lucian did not look at him. His attention remained entirely on Elena Whitmore as he added quietly, it means that sometimes a single moment reveals something that an entire room has overlooked for years. The statement settled across the hall like the first distant rumble of thunder before a storm, and every wolf present sensed that the night was about to change in a way none of them had predicted. The silence after Lucian Blackthorn's words did not break immediately. It stretched across the hall like a wide horizon, calm yet heavy with expectation. Elena Whitmore felt it in the steady rhythm of her breathing, and in the way every lantern flame seemed to flicker a little slower than before. The Alpha King had not raised his voice, yet his presence filled the entire space more completely than the carved beams and stone walls surrounding them. For years the Silver Ridge Pack Hall had hosted ceremonies, celebrations, and debates, but never had a single quiet conversation commanded so much attention. Damon Cross shifted again, his frustration now impossible to hide. Your Majesty, he said, forcing restraint into his tone. With respect, I believe this matter has been examined thoroughly. Elena Whitmore has no role in our leadership, and there is nothing further to discuss. Several wolves near the front benches exchanged uneasy glances. Damon's impatience had begun to sound dangerously close to disrespect. Lucian turned his head slowly toward him. The movement alone drew every eye in the room. For a moment, the Alpha King simply regarded Damon with calm observation. Then he spoke, his voice even and deliberate. You are mistaken. Damon blinked. Your Majesty? Lucian's gaze returned to Elena. There is still one detail that has not been considered. The words caused a faint ripple of curiosity through the assembled pack. Elena felt it as clearly as a change in weather. Her heart remained calm, but her senses sharpened as though something important stood just beyond the edge of understanding. Lucian studied her expression for another quiet moment. Miss Whitmore, he said, earlier you explained that you felt free when the rejected bond ended. Yes, Your Majesty. And you believe that your path tomorrow morning will be the same as it was today. Elena gave a small nod. That was my expectation. Lucian considered her answer carefully. Then he spoke again, though this time his voice carried a subtle warmth beneath its calm surface. Expectations, he said slowly, are often based on incomplete information. Damon frowned. Your Majesty, I do not understand. Lucian did not look at him. Instead he addressed the hall as a whole, his words carrying easily across the rows of seated wolves. For generations, many packs have believed that the strength of a bond depends only on rank, reputation, or the opinion of others. Yet time has proven that assumption unreliable. Several elders along the front benches nodded thoughtfully. The Alpha King's words were not merely commentary. They sounded closer to a lesson. Lucian then turned back toward Elena, his silver eyes thoughtful but steady. Miss Whitmore, may I ask you something personal? Elena felt the attention of the entire hall settle on her once more, but she did not look away. Of course, Your Majesty. Lucian spoke quietly. When Damon Cross rejected you, did you feel anything else besides relief? The question surprised her. Elena considered the moment again in her memory, replaying the quiet second when Damon's words had echoed through the hall. At first there had been the strange sense of release she had described earlier. But beneath that, there had been something else. Something she had not fully understood at the time. She hesitated. I felt something change, she admitted carefully. Change how? Elena searched for the right words. It felt like the moment a locked door opens and fresh air enters a room that has been closed too long. A soft murmur moved through the hall. Lucian nodded slowly, as though her description confirmed an observation he had already made. Damon crossed his arms, clearly irritated. With respect, Your Majesty, that sounds like nothing more than emotion. Lucian finally looked directly at him again. The patience in his expression had not disappeared, but there was a new firmness beneath it. Not emotion, the Alpha King replied calmly. Recognition. The single word settled across the hall like the first drop of rain before a storm. Damon stared at him. Recognition of what? Lucian's gaze returned to Elena Whitmore, and when he spoke again his voice carried a quiet certainty that silenced every whisper in the room. Recognition, he said slowly, of a bond that has been waiting much longer than anyone in this hall realized. The word recognition lingered in the air like a distant bell echoing across a quiet valley. For several seconds no one in the Silver Ridge Hall moved. The assembled wolves looked from the Alpha King to Elena Whitmore and back again, trying to understand what they had just heard. Damon Cross was the first to break the silence, though his voice no longer carried the same confidence it had earlier in the evening. Your Majesty, he said carefully, I believe there must be some misunderstanding. Lucian Blackthorn did not answer immediately. His silver eyes remained on Elena, calm and thoughtful, as though he were listening to something deeper than the conversation in the room. Finally he spoke, his tone steady and unmistakably certain. There is no misunderstanding. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Damon shook his head slightly. But that is impossible. Elena Whitmore has never shown any sign of a bond with anyone of rank. She lives 3 miles from the main pack grounds. She rarely attends gatherings. She has no position within the territory. Lucian turned toward him slowly. And yet she stands here tonight with more composure than anyone else in this hall. The quiet statement carried surprising weight. Damon opened his mouth again, but no words came. Lucian continued, his voice calm but firm. Strength does not always appear where people expect to find it. Sometimes it waits in silence until the moment it is needed. The king then shifted his attention back to Elena. Miss Whitmore, when Damon Cross rejected you, you said the bond stopped being yours to carry. That was true, but you also described a change, a sense of a door opening. Elena nodded slowly, remembering the strange clarity she had felt in that moment. Yes, Your Majesty. Lucian took one more step closer, though he kept a respectful distance. That feeling was not simply relief. It was the release of something that had been standing in the way of another bond entirely. A low murmur moved across the benches. Several elders leaned forward, their expressions thoughtful. Damon looked openly stunned. Another bond? Lucian's gaze did not leave Elena as he answered. Yes. The hall grew still again. Elena felt the strange awareness in her chest return, stronger than before. It was not overwhelming or frightening. It felt more like standing at the edge of a wide, open field just before sunrise, when the air changes and the horizon begins to glow. Lucian studied her quietly, as though confirming what he already knew. Then he spoke words that carried clearly to every corner of the hall. Elena Whitmore, the bond one sensed when I entered this room does not belong to Damon Cross. Damon's breath caught audibly. Your Majesty, you cannot mean. Lucian raised one hand slightly, and the interruption ended before it began. The bond belongs to me. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rose from the benches, followed by stunned silence. Wolves looked at one another in disbelief. Even the elders appeared momentarily speechless. An Alpha King declaring a bond with an unknown Omega during a pact ceremony was something none of them had ever witnessed. Elena herself stood perfectly still, her mind trying to catch up with what she had just heard. Lucian's expression softened slightly as he continued speaking, though his voice still carried the authority of a ruler accustomed to being heard. When I arrived at Silver Ridge tonight, I sensed a bond somewhere in this hall. It was faint at first, like the first star appearing in the evening sky. I assumed the ceremony would reveal its source. But the moment Damon Cross rejected you, the barrier that had been hiding that bond disappeared. Elena felt warmth rise slowly through her chest, the same calm clarity she had felt earlier returning with greater strength. Lucian continued, his gaze steady and sincere. The bond one sensed did not weaken when the rejection occurred. It grew clearer. The words settled over the room with quiet certainty. Damon looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Across the hall, Grandmother Mabel Whitmore closed her eyes briefly, a soft smile touching her face as if she had been waiting for this moment far longer than anyone realized. Lucian addressed the room one final time. Damon Cross believed that rejecting Elena Whitmore would remove her from this ceremony. Instead, it revealed something the entire pack had overlooked. The king then turned fully toward Elena, his voice lowering slightly, but still carrying across the silent hall. The woman you dismissed, he said calmly, was never meant to stand beside you. His silver eyes met hers with unwavering certainty. She was meant to stand beside a king.